Godwin's here. Welcome to this interview, part of an interview series on the broad topic of healing our earth through compassion. Today, we'll be interviewing Mr. Steve Hickman. Steve is the founding director of the UCSD Center for Mindfulness and the executive director of the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. As I said, the overall topic for today and for this series is healing our earth through compassion. It's no news that our Earth's well-being is facing a crisis. And despite a plethora of data and many available technologies to manage the crisis, many nations still fail to meet the expectations of the Paris Agreement. Indeed, many communities and individuals say that they would like to do more. But we're running out of time and we need to find complementary solutions. So to kick it off, Steve, could I ask you to introduce yourself and maybe share something interesting about yourself or your life?
Something interesting, yes. So yes, you described my professional roles. I'm a clinical psychologist as well, just to kind of add to the mix. And I am someone who, while I'm a clinical psychologist, I never imagined for most of my life that I would ever be a psychologist, or certainly not in the field of mindfulness and compassion. So I guess a lot of people don't have master plans that actually play out the way they expect them. I don't know what it was that I thought I would be doing, but it wasn't this, but I'm happy to be where I am, including happy to be here with you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Listen, we appreciate the work you've been doing in the field of compassion and self-compassion. Could you tell us a little bit more about the work you do around the world in this field?
Yeah, so as the executive director for the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion, I am basically responsible for fulfilling the mission of the center, which is to basically create a more compassionate, self-compassionate world, which means a number of different things. Largely what our organization is built around a wonderful program called Mindful Self-Compassion that was developed by Dr. Chris Germer and Dr. Kristen Neff, two of the leading researchers and clinicians. Chris is a clinician, Kristen is a researcher, who study and work with mindfulness and compassion in a variety of different ways. So they created this wonderful 8-week program that's now being taught around the world. We've trained over 2,700 teachers of this program, and they're probably teaching in maybe 40, 45 languages around the world. I think we've estimated that perhaps 100,000 people maybe have taken our courses from one of our teachers over the past several years. So our organization supports and builds community around those teachers, raises awareness of compassion and self-compassion in various ways, and introduces people to the practice of self-compassion in a variety of different ways. So that's my day job. I also oversee professional training. So I oversee the training of teachers of mindful self-compassion and developing the teacher training process. And under other circumstances, when travel's possible, I often do a lot of that training and teaching of the program around the world, and have had wonderful opportunities to teach self-compassion in far-flung parts of the globe, which for me, I would just add that one thing I've learned from that experience, I've had this wonderful opportunity to meet so many people, but our challenges around being more compassionate and self-compassionate seem to be global. They don't seem to be local or specific to any particular culture or settings, such that challenges with perfectionism and self-criticism and shame pop up in every culture that I've been in contact with all over the world. So there is something universal about the need to be compassionate and to be self-compassionate in particular that seems to be relatively universal.
Steve, thank you so much for that overview. And if I may say, for the work you do around the world, it's very touching to me. And I may also say that in some of the monasteries I've been involved in the work with you, it's been a great pleasure. Can I ask you to share with us briefly what is compassion and how does it differ from self-compassion? Just to understand that, maybe if there's a nuance there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that we make the assumption that everyone knows what we mean when we say compassion, or we all think we know what we mean when we say compassion. So I think that kind of the simplest definition of compassion in general is a deep awareness of the presence of suffering and coupled with a desire to relieve that suffering. If you just have the awareness of suffering, that's empathy. You can be witness to suffering, but if you're just witness and you don't hold it in the larger space of wishing in some way to relieve that suffering, that is only empathy. So empathy is a one-way street. Compassion is a two-way street. And self-compassion is really nothing more than including oneself in that same circle of compassion. It isn't really a separate thing. It's just that often we tend to overlook ourselves when we are tuned into our own compassion. We can find that something like, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of us tend to be more compassionate towards our friends and loved ones than we are towards ourselves. And that disparity is something that is is job security for us who teach self-compassion. It's widespread and it's everywhere. That if you ask a group of people, I've done it literally hundreds of times, and you ask how many people find that you're more compassionate to your friends or loved ones than you are to yourselves. It's always in the mid 80s to 90% of people. So we have a tendency to be hard on ourselves and not extend that compassion to ourselves in addition to what we can offer to other people. The good news about that is when we're teaching people self-compassion in a mindful self-compassion program, we're not really teaching people anything new. I mean, we operate on the premise, first of all, that we all have a compassionate heart. We all just want to be happy and free from suffering. And we generally are able to do that for other people. So all we're really learning in a self-compassion program is how to make a U-turn with our compassion so that we actually include ourselves as well. So we're applying the same practice, just turning it towards ourselves rather than some, special new process or new practice.
Lovely, thank you. And later on in this interview, we're going to explore how, rather than making a U-turn as such, how we can extend our energy of compassion outward towards the broader earth, the broader living ecosystem. So thank you for helping us understand that. Next question, Steve. Is compassion something that is better understood intellectually? You just gave us a very succinct definition. It seems clear to me. Or is it something that is understood otherwise, for example, from the heart or from personal experience? Can you comment on that?
Yeah. I was thinking, it might be the difference between reading a book about love and being in love, which is the sort of obvious answer to your question, which is compassion. While it's helpful to know something about it, it's really all in the experience of it, which makes it challenging. It's challenging to teach. We often tell our teachers, or I tell our teachers, you're not teaching about self-compassion, you are teaching self-compassion. So conceptually, it's okay to know something about it. Obviously, it might help you to then practice it. But if you're not actually practicing it, it's not that helpful. You can read a ton of books and watch a bunch of videos about exercise. But as long as you're just sitting in your chair watching videos about exercise, you're not actually deriving any benefits, right? The same is true with compassion, mindfulness, all of these things. They are really a practice, not an idea. It does help to know something about it, to be motivated to why you would want to do something, like why it would be good. I can give you lots of reasons why it's a good idea to practice self-compassion, and then you actually have to do it for it to take effect. I'll tell people too, like if you wanted to learn to swim, you wouldn't read a book about it. And you also wouldn't go to the pool to take lessons from someone who won't get in the pool with you because they're afraid they're going to drown, right? You don't want that. So we also have to be practicing it not only to derive the benefits of it, but also to share it with other people too. We all have to be in it, I guess, in it to win it, like they say. So,
In it to win it. Love it. Thank you. Um, I appreciate that. Can you, I'm just wondering, so you've taught it so many times and you're with so many different groups around the world. Can you share an example from the many sessions you facilitated where an individual or a group suddenly really attained a felt understanding, some feeling understanding of compassion, some kind of breakthrough moment? Can you relate one of those?
oh, yeah. There've been so many. One that springs to mind. I've taught some programs aimed specifically at men to teach self-compassion to men, because I think that's a group. Well, that is a group of people who is underrepresented in most self-compassion courses. If we have 10% men in the group, that's a surprising number. But we taught a program aimed specifically at men, and one of the things that we teach in self-compassion is that many of us have an inner critic, an inner critical voice that beats us up, that does everything the opposite of self-compassion, is hard on us, tells us we're no good, we'll never amount to anything, we're too weak, we're too stupid, we're not pretty enough, we're not whatever. And it really is a huge burden to carry. And I'm sure people listening to this discussion can relate to this, because a huge number of people have this inner critical voice all the time playing in their ear. So we actually explore this in the Mindful Self-Compassion program in a way where we actually begin to recognize, first of all, you can't eliminate that voice. This is just a phenomenon that happens for people. And if you start to try to resist it or fight it, if you've ever tried to argue back to your inner critic, you found you lose every time. Your inner critic is always smarter than you are, quicker than you are, always has a snappy answer to whatever it is that you have to say. And sometimes we just give up. We feel like, I just can't overcome this inner critic. I guess it must be right, you know? So we have a practice where we explore how that inner critic actually, even though it does it in a very painful, difficult way, is actually trying to help us, is actually trying to keep us safe. And I think of like the most overwhelmed parent who's got a kid who's acting up, and they just have no resources left. And so they yell at their kid, they snap at them, they do things they would never do otherwise, not because they dislike their child or because they're uncompassionate beings, but because they're afraid that that person, that child is going to hurt themselves, that they're not going to achieve, they're not going to have success, etc. So it's a bigger topic. But the point was, we have this guy who went through our exercise where you actually recognize how your inner critic is actually trying to keep you safe. And then you introduce your compassionate voice, the other part of you that wants you to change for very different reasons, not because there's something wrong with you, but because you want the best for yourself. So he went through this exercise, and we noticed at the end he was just crying like crazy, just tears rolling down. And he said, we did this exercise. He said he was maybe in his 60s. He'd been in therapy for a lot of his life. He had struggles with weight and substance abuse and things over the years. Really had a tough time. And he said, what I discovered, he said, was when I paid attention to my critical voice that I'm usually trying to avoid or get away from, it was the voice of my father. And I kind of had always known that. But when you suggested that that inner critic was actually trying to help me, but was just inept, was just not good at what it was doing. So it was going about it in a very difficult, in a very bad way, but it meant well. I suddenly saw my father in a different light. I saw that as a parent, he was scared to death that he was not going to be a good enough father. And so he was so critical of me all the time because he was afraid that something bad would happen to me. So all of these years that I spent kind of hating my father for being so hard on me, I can now see where he was coming from. And so this was something that happened in the span of a weekend workshop. And this is a guy who'd been going to therapy for years. But in that moment of actually being a little bit kinder, even with his inner critic, everything spun around for him. And it was just, I mean, I get shivers when I think of that experience because it just was so profound,
Mm,
mainly by virtue of him just actually directing a little kindness to
mm,
his own self.
mm. Beautiful. Thanks so much for sharing that. It sounds like it was a huge breakthrough for him, a big shift. Last question in this first section of the interview. What does it feel like, compassion? Is there a, can you describe it in words? Maybe it's not something we can describe in words. I've also heard you say that there's a particular sound we can associate with it. So I'm just wondering
Yeah.
if you can help us describe a little bit what it feels like and maybe what it sounds like.
Yeah. Often we're human beings, but we're usually more like human doings. We're always doing stuff, right? And we're always trying to make things happen. And compassion is really about, at least towards ourselves, is about, well, towards others as well, isn't about making anything else happen. It's actually showing up with our own tender beating hearts in the moment with kindness. And so often it's letting go of a struggle, like struggling to be someone else, or more often trying not to feel something that we feel. So we say, oh, I shouldn't be so, tearful, or I shouldn't be sad, or I shouldn't be anxious. What's wrong with me? There's something wrong with me. And there's all this trying. And there's a kind of tension to that. And compassion is saying, wow, like you're anxious, just acknowledging this is here. So there's a letting go of the struggle, and there's the sound would be something like ah, like just the letting go of trying to be any different than you actually are. I sometimes will ask in a meditation, what would it be like to let go of needing anything to be any different in this moment? This is one aspect of the compassion, letting go of needing anything to be any different, even when it's difficult, because sometimes what we face is difficult. And we're not talking about pretending it's easy or trying to get away from it, but can we just relate to it because it's here? The other sound of self compassion is something that's a little more warm, which is, when we're having a hard time, instead of beating ourselves up for having a hard time, like, wow, you're really anxious. What's wrong with you? You shouldn't be anxious. You should be whatever. Um, what if you could say to yourself the same thing you might say to a friend who was really nervous about something that they had no control over and was maybe far into the future? You can't just, I always say the worst advice anyone can give anyone else is don't worry, because it's never worked in the history of mankind. And
Right.
even if you try to do it, it doesn't. So what if you could just say, wow, this is really hard. You're really having a hard time right now, just acknowledging the struggle. And then it's something more, the sound is something more like, oh, and that, you know, tough guys like you and me, we're not necessarily all soft and squishy and say, oh, but sometimes we need to,
Yeah.
sometimes just acknowledging you're having a hard time, you're angry, you're sad, you're anxious, you're grieving, just acknowledging that, and to say, this is hard. Again, like a friend is grieving the loss of their parent or their, partner or whatever it might be. We can't bring that person back. There's nothing you can say that repairs damage, but we don't have to do that. All we have to do is say, I'm here for you. I love you, and I know this is hard.
Yeah.
And could we actually just do that for ourselves? And there's that sort of the warmth and the letting go that I think is the feeling of compassion. I would just say one other thing about the feeling of self-compassion, because it's important to say this. Some of us have grown up and had experiences where we really needed compassion and we didn't get it. Maybe from a caregiver, a parent, a teacher, a grandparent, some significant person. And we figured out a way to get through life or those experiences by pretending we didn't need the compassion, by just storing away the hurt. You think of the child that gets hurt and comes crying to their mother, and the mother says, you're going to cry. I'm going to give you something to cry about, and, wax them or whatever. So their need for compassion gets paired with an unpleasant experience, or they don't get the compassion they need. So sometimes we've had people have those kind of experiences and they store them up over time, because they just have to get through them. You just figure out a way to make it all work. And then when you decide, no, I really want to be more kind to myself, I want to be more compassionate, and you start to give yourself compassion, sometimes what you actually get is that old pain all coming back. Because before, needing compassion was paired with pain. So getting compassion can bring up some of that pain. We call it backdraft. It's just a matter of saying that when you give yourself kindness, you get the opposite. It's probably a sign that this is something you really need. And maybe what you might need is a lighter dose as you get used to this practice, because some of us have gone a long time without much kindness directed towards ourselves.
Yeah, thank you for that. Later in a few moments, we'll be talking about other kinds of difficult emotions. For example, what's called climate anxiety, or ecological grief, or eco grief. These feelings of despair when we look around at the world out there and see all the suffering. And as you were describing, so many of us have become very skilled at pushing that away and sort of just getting on with it, getting on with life, and sort of suppressing those feelings rather than holding them and maybe managing them differently. And so we'll ask a few questions later about if compassion can help us hold those feelings.